without lunch. Sorry. Uh, my name is Enrique Visoso. I'm a supply chain consultant, and you might have seen me around, but I work with John Fries, who is the director of UTC's Center for Professional Education. We collaborate in the development of our supply chain continuing education program. So John wanted me to excuse him. He unfortunately had a conflict that is going to make him a few minutes late to our event today, but he will be joining us here shortly. I want to go through a couple of announcements before we introduce our speaker and get right into our topic for the day, which I know you're all anxious to listen in and learn from Kevin Cooper. First, really want to acknowledge and show our appreciation for the partnerships. UTC CPE could not do this without the Chattanooga Regional Manufacturers Association and Megan King, President and CEO of CRMA. Thank you. As well as University of Tennessee Center for Industrial Services, and George and Dwayne and obviously Kevin and the crew really have been very supportive as we collaborate in this ongoing developing supply chain network, as we're working to develop a network and providing continuing education to help all of you out on the field have more effective supply chains. Before we get to Kevin, let me just some reminders, some announcements. First, most of you may be familiar, we are running a series of courses on APEX. Starting on August 25th, here in less than 2 weeks, we have a certified supply chain professional. It's really been great. We've got 12 people signed up for the program, which is more than double of what we had last year. So if you're participating, thank you. If you're interested, let us know. We can probably still squeeze somebody in if they want to participate in this program August 25th. And if you're looking for the APEX program that is more focused in production and inventory management, or CPIM, we will be starting that class on January 16th. All of these programs, as you can imagine right now, we are going online as we follow UTC's policies and making sure we provide everybody a safe environment and work within your company's requirements. As we talk about the subject of risk management, risk planning, which is obviously our topic for today, Kevin is going to give you some lessons learned and a view of a process that he has used with some customers of UTCIS that he will share with you. But we also want to let you know that we can't fit a complete program and process in a lunch and learn. So on October 8th, Kevin is going to lead a workshop in which we're going to dive into the details of the process. And you're actually we have the opportunity to work through the process and start building what could be a risk planning, risk management process for your company. And you'll find that this process is very scalable. So it doesn't have to be a complete corporate or a company. The risk management and risk planning is something that you could do at your department level or site level. So it's a very flexible tool and process that we will be going through and really learning about. Thank you for UT Center for Industrial Services. And let me go ahead and introduce you to our speaker, his background and experience, and make him very qualified to hit on this subject. And then I'll pass it on to Kevin. So Kevin, he is a solutions consultant with UTCIS. He had over 25 years of experience in supply chain and various leadership roles between manufacturing companies and automotive and as well as pharmaceutical industries. He's dealt with risk mitigation, contingency planning, strategic planning, and sales and operations planning in various areas. He holds an operations management degree from University of Tennessee, and he also maintains certification the certifications that I just talked about from Apex on CSCP and CPIM. He works for the UTCIS group. He does a number of trainings as well as consulting. If you're interested, by the way, in UTCIS services, also let us know. They provide a wide range of services to support the industry in our great state of Tennessee. So, Kevin, I guess after this introduction, I'm going to stop keeping people away from the main reason they're here. So, pass it on to you. Thank you, Kevin.
All right, thank you. Hey, great introduction. Hey, so on the supply chain risk management, that's just something I've done, for 100 years, and it seems to have always been embedded within my responsibilities. And this is a fun topic. Actually, you think it'd make you paranoid, but it's really not. It's a fun thing to explore. So I'm gonna make you all work starting out, and I want to do a quick poll. And since we first started hearing about COVID around the first of the year, late last year, how many articles have you all seen about business continuity, risk management, anything along that line? And just use the chat function. But how many, and just guess at it, how many have you seen on that? Oh, wow. Okay. I think Gordon wins so far, or too many with Scott. That's good. Yeah, it's been a bunch of articles like that. And of the articles that I've seen, I was looking at a lot of them as well. I've seen the same thing that you were. And the one thing that I really noticed in looking at these articles is that people tell you why you need to have one. And they give you some really high level advice on what you need to do to create one. But at the end of most of those articles, in fact, all of the ones that I've seen, it really didn't tell you how to create a supply chain risk management plan. And I'll use several terms interchangeably. It may be supply chain resilience. It may be business continuity. It doesn't really matter. We're all talking about the same thing, and where I'm going with that. So anyway, what we're going to talk about is basically a little bit about supply chain uncertainty. We've got to talk a little bit about that first, and then we're going to talk about how easy it is to put one of these guys together. So I'm going to go ahead and throw out a couple of terms, and that's supply chain risk and resilience. Now, I'm generally going to be simplifying here, oversimplifying, but supply chains are generally designed either to minimize costs or to maximize the reliability. And, there are a lot of them that fall in between the two, but those are two things that we really look at. You need to decide what's most important to you, the risk or the reliability. And that largely is going to be driven by the culture within your organization and what is important to them. Now, if you want a supply chain that's going to be resilient, you have to identify the risk against that supply chain. And that's not the primary goal today, getting that resilience, but it's going to be a byproduct of looking at the risk that threaten a supply chain. So we're going to talk about the timeline, because really risk is time sensitive. So quick question, can you all see the pointer? Okay, give me a thumbs up if you can. Oh, wait a minute, over here? How about that? Okay, never mind. Okay, we got okay, I'm having to work off two screens here. Okay, so the area, I'm gonna get rid of that pointer. I'm gonna operate without it. The area in gray basically is where you're doing your supply chain contingency planning. You're looking at your options, you're identifying the risks that are within that supply chain. The more work that you do there, the less impact you're going to feel from a certain event that occurs. Again, the inverse is true. The less that you do at planning for those risks and looking at your plans, and that's within the gray area, the more you do there, the less you'll feel. The less you do there, the more you'll feel the impact, the risk. In fact, you'll feel the full impact of the risk if you do nothing. Now, with COVID, I'm gonna bring that up several times just because it's something that we're all thinking about. But when COVID first started hitting the scene, we really didn't know what it was, how it would affect us, whether it was a local or global thing. But as time went on, we started learning a little bit more about that. And what we found out is that this may be a disruptive event. So I was talking to a friend of mine at a major chemical company, and this was before March when it really started affecting us. And he was telling me that one thing that they did was they sent 100 people home to work remotely. And that was, they were learning, can we operate within this environment? So that's an activity. It's kind of late in the game, but that's an activity within the gray zone that you see of creating a contingency plan and prevention to determine, can we operate like this? Is this new normal something that we can do to support the business? Next thing you're going to see on that chart is the response activation trigger. And that's something that a lot of these plans just don't talk about, but it is crucial to where we're going today on this. I call it bad news early, okay? In fact, on this morning when I checked the weather, I saw that we've got a tropical storm, Josephine, and it's in the Atlantic right now. Okay, well, if I'm on the East Coast, I don't know how that's going to affect me, but I want to know whether that's going to hit me or not. So I'm looking at it right now. That's not a trigger yet, but depending on the course that tropical storm takes, it may, hit the Bahamas and say, okay, this is getting real. This is a trigger. I need to implement my plan and do something about it. So looking at the hurricane example, if you hear one is on the way, you're really no longer in the gray zone. You've hit your trigger. Okay, so you don't have time to build retaining walls or shore up your foundations or anything like that. The best you can hope to do is get plywood, batteries, beer and strawberry Pop-Tarts, if that's your thing. You've got no time to react, but you've got a plan laid out and you can go ahead and implement that plan. You don't have to figure out what do you have to do on that. So, put this under your pillow, because when you're looking at risk mitigation or risk management, this chart really tells you where you are and what zone you're in. Now, right now with COVID, we're in the middle of that. We're in crisis management right now. No one really saw this one coming. We're feeling the full effect of it. And immediately when business started shutting down, you saw a lot of people going into the response mode, but they really didn't have a response plan. So it hurt really bad because of that. And that's one thing that we're going to talk about. Oh, the one other thing is that, we're not done yet. Right now, we're feeling the full effect of COVID, but it's going to happen again on the next one, whatever it is, unless we invest some time within that gray zone on this chart. All right, so dealing with uncertainty. This is probably one of my favorite quotes, but it's about what you know and what you don't know. So you've got your known knowns. Those are the things that you know. Okay, that's a normal variation within a process. The supplier is going to be late. You're going to have a normal demand variation. Your anything can get tied up. A truck can have a flat tire. That is the normal things that happen, the normal variation within your process. And you know what? You don't really need a risk mitigation plan for that because you already have that built in to your systems. It may look like safety lead time, safety stock, inventory, whatever. You've already got that built in. Those are the things that you can control, and you pretty well know what they are. The next thing are your known unknowns. And there's just some things that we don't really know out there. An example of that are the tornadoes that we saw in Nashville. We know that they're going to occur. We don't know when. We don't know how bad. COVID-19 recovery. we don't know what that looks like. You know, is it a gentle slope? Is it going to, you know, is it wavy? Is it going to drop off? We just don't know, but we do know that it's going to happen. Another thing that you see in that zone, another known unknown, is I'm going to call it enthusiastic variation. You know, we have a normal variation within our supply and demand and the lead times and things like that. But sometimes we'll get that enthusiastic variation where it swings far wider than what we ever thought would happen. And that is one of those areas that's a known unknown. We know that we're going to have variation, but we really didn't know about how much. The last one is what keeps us up at night, and that's the unknowns. And let's just face it, that's Murphy having a bad day. Okay, I mean, even Murphy didn't see it coming. COVID-19, the tsunami in Japan, 9/11, those are the unknown unknowns. But you can still create a risk plan against those things, even if you don't have that certainty. Okay, so let's look at some of the different levels of risk that merit a different response. The ones toward the bottom of this chart, those are your known knowns. Okay, you've got that built into your plans already. You don't need formal documentation. You know what the variation is of your process, so everything is fine right there. It's the other things, the things that are not known, and really the things that you have very little control over. And those are your natural disasters, epidemics, terrorist attacks, and things like that. Those are the things that really deserve to have a plan in case those things happen. Now, the funny thing about that is you look at it and you look at like natural disasters or things like that. Well, an earthquake, you know, you think, well, we've had some earthquakes in Western North Carolina, and it's just, you know, been a little bit of a tremor, no real big deal. But when you look at something like that, you know, like Reelfoot Lake was formed in a 1911 and 1912 earthquake. So those things do happen, and you really need to you know, even though it doesn't seem that likely, you need to look at it and then get a plan. And we're gonna talk about that in just a moment. So the elements of a risk management plan is basically tied together by your intelligence, analysis, treatment, and monitoring. And you know, they're in those 400 or 500 articles that you all were saying that you saw, we've seen those called a lot of different things. One of my favorite is that you need to identify, prioritize, and mitigate that risk. Okay, that sounds pretty simple. There's also a fourth step in there, and that is after you've mitigated that risk, you need to sustain the program. And I'm going to spend some time on that on the last slide. So first thing is pulling a plan together. Now, you really need to see your supply chain. You really need to understand it. It sounds easy. It is easy, but it takes some effort to do that. And you need a very good understanding of what your supply chain is. The way we do that is supplier network planning. And this is one of those things where you map out that supply chain. You identify the critical factories, suppliers, who's the sole source, who is the single source, what about your logistics? Do you have alternatives? Is it, you know, unique? Is it a commodity item? What suppliers have continuity plans and which don't? What suppliers can you really trust? Which ones can you not? Where have problems occurred in the past? Who's running at capacity? You know, just things like that. Who has very little volume, and you don't know how long that they're going to be in business. Within this whole process, that is a crazy important step. You've got to do this, and you've got to have a thorough understanding and visibility of your supply chain. It doesn't have to be pretty at all. I mean, it can be some of the best ones I've seen have been butcher paper on the wall and Post-it notes and Sharpies, and that, you know, that has worked just perfect. But you need to see it, you need to understand it, and if you do nothing else in your supply chain risk mitigation, do this and understand it because it will give you an understanding of what risks are out there. So this one looks pretty, I guess pretty. Here's one that's about 10 years old, okay? And this is looking well, you know, I've been in pharmaceutical all my life. And this is one that we created for about a $400 million product. So you think that's a big, you know, big product, it should get something really fancy? Well, no, not really. This was done in Visio, you know, same as some of the butcher paper examples. But what I wanted was something that showed me where the handoffs occur, where the value-added steps were, you know, when the product is moving, how long is it moving, how long is my supply chain, what inventory do I have at certain areas, so that I know that if there's an interruption in one area, I know how long I'll have a continued flow. But also, if I try to restore that flow, I'll know how long it takes to get that material to where it needs to be. So it doesn't have to be fancy at all. And this one served us well because it covered the material and information flow, and it allowed us to get the right people discussing these things and looking at them and then getting ideas out on paper. And this is a brainstorming 101 example. So for the risk identification, this is probably one of the areas where I felt least comfortable, because, you know, we're dealing with unknowns and uncontrollable also. So how do you identify the unknown? Well, actually you can, and you can do a pretty good job at it just by looking at that network and asking yourself, what can go wrong with this process? Now, when we started this out, we had a pretty small team, but we learned really quickly that that small team was not capturing all of the sources of risk. And at the end of this process, I ended up with a 6-page list of potential supply chain risk by category. And that was extremely useful because it brought visibility to areas that normally we would just not see. It didn't mean that we had to address all of those items on the 6th page. We just needed to bring that out in the open and understand, was this potential risk relevant to the supply chain that we had? That's the reason, I mean, because there's so many potential sources of risk, that's the reason you need to have a cross-collaboration team so that you're capturing all of the things that can happen. An interesting thing that came up is that we were looking at SAP as one of our areas that needed a really risk mitigation plan. Now you look at SAP and you're thinking, well, what can go wrong? You know, you're thinking of the system crashing. You're thinking of, you know, of course, the normal things, information being wrong in there. You're thinking of cybersecurity. And cybersecurity is one of those things that we were really worried about. And at the end of this exercise and looking at that as a potential area of risk, what we determined was that the biggest risk that we had was getting the information from the local manufacturing site to the mothership in North Carolina. So our biggest threat in this case was a backhoe cutting a T3 line, you know, at the front of the building. Okay, we could handle any other things that happened to that system, but it came down to that T3 line. So the point is that you need to look internal, you need to look external, you need to look at material, you need to look at information. And it's enough to make your head hurt a little bit, but you can quickly narrow down what are the major sources of risk to your supply chain. All right, so the reason that you want to identify all those risks is that you'll have layers of defense to protect you from that risk. Now, some things are going to get through, but the more protection that you've got, the more resilient, more secure that your supply chain is going to be. It can come from anywhere, and it's going to be things that you really don't expect. When I was preparing this slide, the power went out and I lost my connection. Of course, I'm operating off a laptop, so I didn't lose the file, but I did lose my connectivity. Well, I fired up my jetpack in a hurry, but that was a source of protection that I had, and it allowed me to continue business as usual with really no disruption at all. That's just a good example of that. Okay, we talked a little bit about the workshop and pulling pulling this information together. I'm not saying that you've got to have the tool that I'm using. In fact, exactly the opposite. The things that I'm talking about are probably within your toolbox right now, but I just needed a way to compile that information. So NIST MEP created a workbook that helped us organize those thoughts. So this is it. This is what you're seeing, but you can do that on a scrap sheet of paper if you want, but it's the process that's important, not the tool. Now, you remember the risk categories that we saw? Well, in this example, the first risk category would be logistics. Okay, so when we did our brainstorm and we identified that volatile fuel prices was a risk that we had. Well, that's not really a risk, but you know, that's a risk name, okay? So what about volatile fuel prices? Well, the risk description, which is the inbound and outbound freight costs, are sensitive to an increase in fuel prices. Okay, we looked at it, we've identified it, and actually within this group, we've got a lot of logistics providers, so it's really relevant. I'm glad that example came up, and this is just from a case study that I use. But anyway, we've identified the category, risk name, and risk description. We've got a good understanding. If you look a little further within that, within the risk that we've identified, you're going to see some of them are supplier facing, some of them are customer facing, and some of them are internal. But what we're going to do is we're going to identify all of those risks and give it a name and describe what it is. From there, well, wait a minute. Let's, before I really get into the risk activation triggers, let's do another quick poll. And starting from the first day that you heard about COVID, how long did it take for you to be affected? Go ahead and use that chat function. Go ahead and share that. That's good. I'm saying a few weeks, 6 weeks, about 3 weeks. And Jeff, you deal with China, so mid-December from the U.S. strike, about 3 weeks. Okay, a little bit early. Okay, actually, that's a pretty long time, isn't it? And we're looking at the trigger. This is this is the bad news early, okay? This is the point where you say, okay, these risks that we've identified, this is going to become real. This is going to be a real risk. So the trigger is the point where you say, hey, we got a problem. We need to put our plan into motion. Okay. For some things, we've got fantastic visibility. And actually for COVID, we had pretty good visibility. I mean, 3 to 6 weeks, that's pretty good. That gives you a lot of time to react. It didn't feel like it when it was occurring, but there are a lot of other risks like the tornadoes that we experienced. You know, those things, there is no trigger, no lead time for the trigger. So the trigger is really important. It's often overlooked because it gives you bad news early so that you can go ahead and implement your plan and quickly restore your business. So these things really need attention, and you're going to look at me address those. In fact, I'm going to do that on this slide right here, which is looking at the trigger and identifying those. So for each risk event, there needs to be some type of pretty clear if-then statement that describes what will happen if that risk event occurs along with the trigger event. So looking at the slide that we've got, we'll stick to the fuel costs, is that if fuel price, and this is your if-then statement, if fuel prices increase, then profit margins can be significantly eroded. So that's why it's important. But but what does increase mean? Okay, is it a little bit? Is it a lot? So your trigger on this is going to be fuel prices increasing 5% over your contract base. Okay, that's pretty clear right there. Fuel prices are important to you. An increase does hurt your business. So when it gets 5% over your contract base, you need to go ahead and implement your plan, your mitigation plan. And you see that for the other examples as well. Now, some of this is well, assumptions are going to be made at that trigger. You know, when do you know that you've got a problem? COVID wasn't very clear with the problem. Hurricanes, it's pretty clear that you've got those. And cybersecurity, those are things that the trigger may not be there. But the better you do at identifying that trigger and capturing the bad news early, the more options that you have got. Okay, I've talked a lot about these risks, and there are going to be a lot of them. There are going to be a lot of them that are going to be brought up because, let's face it, this is a brainstorming exercise. So we have to determine if these things are worth our time and energy. And there are several ways of doing this, but one of the ones that really work out well is the risk scoring fundamentals. And the principle on that is that you look at the severity of the risk, and if it's not going to affect you a great deal, that would be a very low number. But if it's going to have a catastrophic effect on you, that would be a really high impact. On the occurrence, if it's not really likely to occur, then that's going to be a low number. If it's going to occur pretty often or pretty sure, that's going to be a pretty high number if it's inevitable. The risk trigger works kind of the opposite. And if you have a lot of time to react, the trigger number is going to be low. And if you don't have any advanced warning, like an earthquake, that number is going to be pretty high. Now, if that looks like a FMEA to you, that's really because that's what it is, pretty plain and simple. Okay, so there's one other component to this, and again, we're going to see this on a chart in just a second, but there's one other component, and that is the risk criteria, because there are some risks out there that if they would occur, they would have a huge impact on your business, but it's not really likely to occur. Well, looking at the FMEA on those items, they're going to have a low risk impact number, meaning that it's not one of the first ones that you really need to look at. You know, it's not going to be a significant risk. But if it should happen and the severity is really high, even though the occurrence is low, if it should happen, it could really disrupt your business. An example, well, and for that reason, you really need to look at those. So we do highlight that. In fact, the tool does highlight those. An example, 100-year flood. Okay, extremely damaging, whether on your infrastructure, your facility, but it's extremely damaging. But it's improbable. But it still happens every 100 years, right? How about, let's try this example. How about, it sounds like a Stephen King novel. How about a virus for which we have no immunity, affects the world, paralyzing economies? Okay, does that sound familiar? If we go back 8 months, we would think that's funny, that'd never happen. But here we are. So those things that can have catastrophic effect, even though the probability is low, they need to be implemented, or there needs to be some type of plan around those things, even though you're dealing with a great deal of unknown. All right, let's look at it. Let's see what it looks like on a chart. And you're going to, what I'd like to see you do is have a risk impact analysis for every vetted risk event, okay? When I say vetted risk event, keep in mind, we just got through doing a brainstorm exercise, and we've got Post-it notes all over our wall. And even though I'm brainstorming, you know that you don't criticize anything. It's just open thoughts going up there. Well, at some point you look at those and you say, okay, this may deserve our attention. this may not deserve our attention, because let's face it, you all have limited bandwidth. You cannot create a full plan for every risk that's out there. You only create a plan for what's really significant or what you feel is significant. So you got some judgment going on right there. But that's what I mean by vetted risk events. So for those things that rise to the top, the ones that you say, I want to look a little bit more closely at those guys, you're going to do the risk impact analysis on that. So you've got your risk category, you know what that looks like, and you've got the description of the risk. So then you create the if-then statement. No, you've already got your if-then statement. I'm sorry. So you do the ranking that we talked about. What is the severity of that event? What's the likelihood of occurrence? And based on those two functions, what is the criticality of that event? Now, remember, I just got through describing the things that may have a high impact but low probability. Well, the criticality will show up right there on some of those events, saying that, okay, it deserves a little bit of attention. But then I'm going to plug in the trigger on that. That's right over here, but I'll plug in that trigger, and that will tell me how much notice I've got. Based on those components, you're going to have a risk impact number. And basically, a high number is bad. Of course, red is bad, like the traffic light. So you can tell pretty clearly what risks are out there that really need your time, attention, and talents. And it allows you to create a mitigation plan on those items. Now, some of those things that are going to come up in the plan are going to come up with a score that's either, too low to really impact your organization, or it's just something that is so low that you just don't feel like it's appropriate to create a mitigation plan for you. That's fine. That's perfectly fine. In fact, that's what this exercise is all about, is which ones do you need to pay attention to. Let's do another poll real quick. TLAR. Give me a yes or no. Have you heard that term before? Let's use your chat. TLAR. Wow. Okay. Not familiar with it. Okay. This is an old lean term that I used a long time ago, but it's really important for this exercise right here, because once you have done a risk impact analysis, you're going to look at that information, and it's going to tell you which areas, which risk you need to create a mitigation plan for, because it's critical for the continuity of your business. Well, in doing this, you put a lot of numbers down for the severity, occurrence, and the trigger. Now, granted, I would hope that you would have had a consensus so that your team could have collectively looked at it, but the final test is TLAR, and that stands for this looks about right, okay? And it's not a numerical, it's look at it, does it feel right? Does it feel like this exercise gave you the results that you thought you should have? And that's absolutely critical, because it allows you to challenge some of the assumptions that you made. It allows you to align the risk mitigation plan to the priorities that you see within your organization. So don't let this exercise completely drive your behavior. Use your business intelligence in there as well. This is just a guide to get you to the correct decision, but use everything that you've got. And TLAR is a great one. It's a great one. Okay. There's more. I'm going to spare you the details on this, but there are two things that are really important. I'm going to take that back. They're not as important, but it's two things that I want you to consider. And that is, we talk about risk. Well, some risk will affect our whole organization. Some of it will affect only one product family or just have a small effect. That's the value at risk, okay? So if this event occurs, what's it going to cost you, okay? The other one is on your risk mitigation cost. It's not like you poof, and you have the solution and it costs you nothing. Like inventory is a good example for that. If you want to do some decoupling going on, sure, you can do it, but it's going to cost you some money. So you need to know what you're protecting, the value of what you're protecting, and what it's going to cost you to do that. So what I like to do is have a risk or mitigation benefit analysis. And what I do with this guy is I'll put it in dollar terms. What is the value at risk? And then once I put in a mitigation plan, I recalculate what's the mitigated probability that that will occur. And then ultimately what that allows me to do is create an expected mitigation benefit. It's basically, what did I just protect myself from? Now you see the one in red, well, the solution was worse than the problem in that case. So that's really not something that you want to put a plan together on, but at least you've vetted it. The item on the third row, where you're looking at a glass panel supplier potentially going on strike. That is the one that had, or that gives you the greatest mitigation benefit. Of course, the mitigation strategy there is to get an alternate supplier. So it asks the question, you know, what is it? What's the threat in dollar terms? Is it worth the effort to even do it? What do you save from that? In some cases, the benefit's so minimal that you just want to accept that risk, and that's okay. At least you've quantified it, and that you understand. You have a better understanding about what you're doing and why. Beyond that, the risk can be eliminated and planned for. How do you all mitigate risk? That's okay. I'm Poland. I'm going to make you all work a little bit. Give me some ideas. Share with me. How do you mitigate risk? Come on, use that chat function. Multiple suppliers. I like it. I like it. Fire, increase the protection. Good. Keep it coming. Keep it coming. Multiple grocery stores identified. I love it. Ones that stock toilet paper. Yeah. Good. All right. Anybody else? Inventory. Inventory. I was glad that one came up. Okay. The list could go on, and we could probably make a 6-page list on solutions. And again, everybody's got a list. So I just got curious about this, and I thought, well, what are the strategies? What are the major strategies? The first one that I saw that came up, and it's one I really, really like, is that to use suppliers, really to use world-class suppliers, suppliers that are financially strong, competent, ones that would have a risk mitigation strategy on their own. Know who your suppliers are. Perfect. I mean, that is just spot on the money. Because if you've got somebody like that, you don't need to look at the full supply chain. You can stop there at that node because they got it covered the rest of the way. So that is the number one that I've seen really in effectiveness as a supply chain supplier. And I really drive that behavior. Like when you have a supplier or customer relationship meeting with that supplier, what do you talk about? You know, what about their suppliers? So you can even talk about their financials. You can talk about their capacity. What keeps them up at night? You know, what are their risks? So absolutely know your suppliers. And if your supplier does that for you, then you don't have to. The second strategy that I've seen is to compress your supply chain, the lead time, the cycle time variation, reduce that. That's the second most common theme that I've seen to mitigate the risk. And the third one really involves like we saw in the trigger, increase your visibility of the things that are about to happen. And in some cases, I've been guilty of I didn't know I had a problem until the delivery did not end up at the dock. Okay. I should have known a week, 2 week, a month ahead that everything did ship on time and that I could expect that. But if I wait too late and I get complacent on that, then I have fewer options. But the better I have that visibility, the better I see those triggers further out in advance, the better off that I am. So let's talk about this. And really, this is my last slide here. We talked about the risk that identified and mitigated today. But as the calendar rolls on, those risks are going to be obsolete. They're no longer going to be relevant. New challenges have occurred. Your business has changed. So risk mitigation, or risk management, really is an ongoing process. I mean, you're not done after you've got this register created. It has to be reviewed frequently. That will drive a culture of risk-based thinking within your supply chain. And you need to discuss this. You need to embed this in your monthly sales and operations planning. You need to include that in your business review. One thing that we've done in the past was we would talk about 5 of our key products in this, and those 5 would cycle through. So at the end of the year, we've talked about all of our supply chain risk for all of our products. Now, you can put less thought into the risk plan. You can just grab the gems that you saw today and that you like, but you'll have less of a plan. But still, that's okay. Just scale your risk plan to match the priority that it deserves within the organization. If you have a strong driver that you want to create a risk-based culture, then you're going to want to go more thorough on this plan. But if you just want a litmus test to see how am I generally doing, help my understanding a little bit, you don't have to go through these full exercises. Just do the value stream mapping and do the things that help you understand what the risks are. I got nothing else. So are there any questions?
Let me remind everyone, you can type in your questions through the chat box, or you can let us know and we can unmute you if you want to ask a question that may be a little too complicated to put in the chat box. So a couple of questions, Kevin, to begin with. One is, as you've worked with risk mitigation, risk planning processes with either from your experience or now with UTCIS, what are a couple of key lessons learned from that process, from going through that planning process?
That's a good question. The first thing is just do it. Don't worry about having everything together. Don't worry about making the right decisions. Just get that understanding of your business and do this to some degree. I think that's the biggie. The other one is that these things that are out there, they are going to show up again. So when we get to the calm after all of this, don't get complacent, because it's going to be calm until the next one.
Yeah. What with the companies that you've worked for, that you've worked with, what role does leadership play in this entire process? If you're talking to, department managers or even site managers, what's the role of leadership in all of this?
They drive the process. Without the leadership engagement, without leadership talking about it and reinforcing a risk-based culture, it's done in isolation and you don't get much benefit from the process. Let me turn that around. If you have that full leadership engagement, where actually that's where this really hit close to home for me, because the leadership within our organization, this was in pharmaceutical business, absolutely drove me crazy. Every time I would go in and I would talk to him about something, he would say, I want bad news early. Okay. So if there was anything that came up and I could have done something to have identified it earlier and identified the likelihood or the impact. If there was anything I could have done, it would have come up in our discussion, because that person was driving a risk-based culture. He wanted as many options as possible, and to find out something late, then you had very few options. So leadership is absolutely crucial, because they're going to drive the culture, and the culture is what is going to make this effective, not the tool. Good question.
Yeah. So, you've mentioned pharmaceuticals a couple of times. Pharmaceuticals, lots of risk, lots of cost. What's been your experience in applying these processes really outside of such a risk-adverse industry?
Well, you're asking some good questions here, because when you talk about, it's really not about industry so much. It's about your supply chain, because I had product family. Let's say I was launching a product, okay? A new product launch in pharmaceutical, that's when you make money, okay? You make or break it right there. So I was extremely aggressive. I didn't care about the costs. I didn't care about write-offs. I didn't care about any of those things. I wanted a resilient, robust supply chain, so that, like new product launch, you have no idea what the demand is going to be. What's the upside? What's the downside? You have to run scenarios to know when you run into a problem with your capacity. When do you run into a problem, as Shay said, with your supplier capacity? You need to understand all of that really well. So you're not worried about the costs. However, on some of the more mature product families, where you're competing on costs, and you want to minimize write-off, you don't mind being out of stock for a while, because you just don't want, you don't mind that, because the customer will wait and they'll have inventory built within their supply chain. So it's really not industry centric. It really has to do with what's going on with your individual product family supply chain, of which a lot of you all may have multiple product families. And, how do you want to tune that supply chain to match it? So doesn't matter at all. I deal with the same thing in automotive, and the same lessons learned. They're striving toward minimizing costs a little bit more than resiliency, but still resiliency's got to be there as well. So just find the balance that the culture and the priority of your business drives you toward. Good question.
I bet you as you go through this process, you learn a lot about your supply chain, and even beyond risk, you identify, because as you learn about your supply chain, you're able to identify opportunities for improvement and enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of the supply chain. Yeah, very good.
That's good.
Well, I don't think we have any other questions. Kevin, thank you. UTCIS, Chattanooga Regional Manufacturers Association, thank you for your support of our supply chain continuing education events. I do want to remind you what I said earlier. If you want to learn more about the entirety of this process, if you want to not just look at tools and just reactions, but really fully understand how you can implement a robust ongoing process. Once again, the workshop, in which it's about a 3-hour workshop that Kevin will lead on October 8th. You can learn about that at our website, which is utc.edu/CPE. You can contact John, you can contact me, you can ask Megan. If you want any further information, we'll point you in the right direction. So thank you very much for your participation. Again, thank you, Kevin. Appreciate all the information and lessons learned that you've shared with us. And everybody, have a great Friday afternoon. Wish you a great coming weekend. Stay safe.
Thank you all.
Thank you.